Step right up, don't pass by, test your fate, called out an elderly man with a little monkey perched on his shoulder. Only $5, and you'll learn all about your destiny. Some people stopped and, for $5, asked to have their picture taken with the monkey. Others smiled at the old man's naive speeches. A few were charmed by the monkey. Then there were those, mostly women and girls, who dared to pull the fateful ticket from the spinning drum. Mickey, the man addressed his assistant, spin the drum, just like that, so that the beauty can reveal a lucky fate. The monkey spun the drum. Through the transparent glass, various destinies on colorful slips of paper danced in a mesmerizing whirl. Then Mickey would stop the drum, open a little window, and fate ended up in the hands of the person who bought it for $5. When a group of young people, just for fun, pulled tickets, they immediately unfolded them, read them aloud to each other, discussed the destinies, and burst into laughter. Youth, the man admired the boys and girls, carefree, not believing in destiny. Everything seems amusing to them, but life isn't as funny as it appears in youth. Well, it's all right, let them laugh while they're young. There won't be much time for laughter later. Single girls and women approached. They trembled with excitement as they pulled their fateful tickets, stepped aside, sat on a bench, and unfolded the paper. Some smiled at what was written on it, stood up from the bench, squared their shoulders, and confidently walked towards their happy future. Others frowned. The hope that had just lit up in their eyes dimmed, and they slouched even more, wanting to go unnoticed. Larry himself invented the texts he wrote on the colored tickets. For the most part, he leaned towards making people happy, so he wrote about good things. But there had to be a but in contrast to the happy destinies. Not everyone can be happy, and that's the truth. Happiness in Larry's transparent drum exceeded real life, but he enjoyed it when a woman would rise from the bench, smile, and head towards life's challenges, already happy. Sophie had seen this guy with the monkey many times and considered it just a way to earn money, nothing more. She didn't believe in what was written on those slips of paper. She used to pass through the park on her way to or from work, so she was familiar with this sweet duo. She even started to greet the not-so-young man and smile at Mickey's antics. Well, what's the big deal? A person beckons, jokes with people. Some fall for the persuasion, buy a ticket, laugh, and continue on their way. The monkey was amusing, and Sophie often sat on a bench across from the pair, observing the lively trade of destinies. She sat down on a bench, the gentle warmth of the sun caressing her skin and a tender breeze tousling her loose hair. Sophie closed her eyes and smiled at the arrival of spring. It felt so good. "Hey, miss," someone shouted. She didn't know if the shout was directed at her, but just in case, she opened her eyes and turned towards the voice. "Yes, I'm calling you," Larry shouted. The monkey on his shoulder became agitated and started making sounds. "Come over. It's uncomfortable to shout like this. People are already looking at me." "Come, dear people," Larry addressed those who had turned to his voice. "Try your luck, your fate. Just $5 for a ticket, and everyone's life and destiny are different. So don't hesitate. Just $5. Sophie approached the man when he handed fate to a lady of Balzacian age. "Madam, my Mickey gives only beautiful and happy destinies to the ladies," Larry said. The lady reluctantly smiled at Larry and said, "I need 2 tickets. "Why?" Larry was surprised. "Everyone has only one destiny. For a reason." The lady replied curtly, "I want to know my goat's destiny." "Why do you need to know your goat's destiny?" Larry was even more surprised. The lady laughed. "Did you think a goat is just a goat? No, that's my ex-husband. I want to know how he's doing without me." "Oh, I see," Larry smiled. "In that case, it's $10 from you." The lady handed Larry 2 bills. "Mickey," Larry called his partner, "spin the drum." "No need," the lady stopped him. "I can't trust my destiny to a monkey. I'll spin the drum myself." The lady spun the drum, and Larry and Sophie patiently waited for the spectacle to finally come to a halt. Unfolding the pink ticket, the woman read it and gave a wry smile. "Is everything good with your destiny?" Larry inquired curiously. "There are instructions on this fate," the lady responded. It says, "Be kinder, and fortune will smile upon you, and your destiny will become more favorable." "Let's see," she said, and ate her fateful ticket. Larry's eyebrows shot up. He had never seen anything like this before. Sophie, on the other hand, smiled at the lady's naivety. "For the goat, let the monkey spin the drum and fetch the destiny," the lady ordered. Mickey leaped onto the drum, spun it, and pulled out a gray ticket. "A gray destiny," the lady said bitterly. "He was dull in life, and he'll remain that way." She took the ticket and read it. "What nonsense!" the lady exclaimed. "Utter rubbish. Don't look back, or you'll fall and never rise again. Move only forward, and destiny will gift you unimaginable happiness. And this for a goat who doesn't deserve any happiness." "Be kinder," Larry reminded the lady. She shot him a venomous look, crumpled the gray ticket, threw it at the monkey, and walked away. "Well, how can she not believe in my tickets?" Larry remarked. "Destiny gave her a hint. Be kinder, but all she can do is spew poison. So, why don't you come over here with Mickey, dear?" He turned to Sophie. "It's about time we got acquainted. My name is Larry, and you, my beauty, what's your name?" "Sophie," the girl answered and blushed. "A wonderful name. Sophie means wise. Both the name and you are beautiful. But why do you avoid old Larry and not try your luck?" "I'm afraid," Sophie admitted. "You know, things are good for me right now. Sometimes, I can't believe that people can be as happy as I am." "Then what do you have to fear if destiny favors you?" Larry leaned in. "Let me tell you a secret, my dear Sophie. A person can't always be happy. There are happy moments that we remember, and then we live through them, trying to replicate what we've already experienced. But often, those efforts are in vain. I have $5. Here, take them," the girl offered, extending the money. The monkey retrieved the ticket, hopped onto Sophie's shoulder, and handed her a green envelope. Sophie unfolded the paper and read, "Run away from the person who is today the most important in your life, for trouble lies ahead. Without him, a rainbow of happiness awaits, tranquility and confidence in tomorrow." Sophie shivered and flung the ticket away as if it were a venomous snake about to strike. "I was right to be afraid," she sighed disappointedly. "It's all lies. Everything written on this note is a lie. You don't understand how much we love each other, how happy we are. Larry, you don't know, and you don't understand. I'll never, do you hear me, Larry? I'll never run away from James. Our love is 1 in a million. Spring and summer will pass, autumn will come, and he'll return from the army, and I'll wait for him. Do you understand me?" Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes. She spoke angrily and sharply to Larry while people paused to watch the scene unfold. From a distance, it looked like a father and daughter having a dispute, so no one intervened in Larry and Sophie's conversation. "Easy, easy, my girl, easy." Larry hugged Sophie and stroked her head. She buried her face in his chest and cried. Her slender shoulders trembled, and Larry continued to whisper, "Don't cry, Sophie. Everything will be all right." You don't know anything." Sophie sobbed. I don't know, Larry agreed. He poured tea from a thermos into a cup and handed it to Sophie. "Here, have some tea, dear, and everything will pass. It's mint and lemony. It calms and refreshes." Sophie sipped the tea in short sips, still trembling. "Thank you for the tea." She handed Larry the empty cup. "I need to go home now. Goodbye." "Goodbye, my dear child," Larry said sadly. "I'm sorry I upset you. But it's not true, is it?" Sophie asked with hope in her voice. "Let's hope it's not true," Larry replied. Sophie walked slowly towards the park exit, and Larry and the frightened monkey watched her as she left. Sophie had been in such a good mood, and Larry had ruined everything. There's no way she'll believe that she should run away from James. Just yesterday, Sophie received a letter from him, so sweet and warm. She read it over and over again, and she'll continue to read it every day until the next one arrives. How could anyone in their right mind run away from such love? Sophie had never loved anyone in her life as much as she loved James, except maybe her younger brother Doug. "Stop it!" Sophie shouts at her parents, but in the midst of their eternal war, they don't hear their desperate daughter's cry. Doug looked at Sophie with a plaintive expression and pleaded, "Sophie, don't shout, please. I'm scared." That's when Sophie took her brother's hand, and they stepped outside. Here, the screams and quarrels were drowned by different sounds that somewhat calmed Doug. They walked until late, until their father fell asleep. When he did, their mother would calm down, start cooking with angry clatter of dishes, and that's when Sophie and Doug would return home. When James returns from the army, they will marry, and they'll take Doug with them. As home can become unbearable, sometimes, it seemed to Sophie that she was actually losing her mind. Why did she and Doug have to live in such horror? James' family was a true family, close-knit. His father, Kyle, a retired lieutenant colonel, strict, but Sophie had never heard him raise his voice or witness any hatred within James' family. Linda, James' mother, was the kind of woman Sophie aspired to be, always well-groomed, calm, with perfect order in the house, and she cooked deliciously. Sophie rarely saw James' brother since he was away at a military aviation school most of the time. Kyle insisted on James entering the aviation school, but James didn't want to be in the military. He didn't want a life of constant subordination. He argued that he was a free individual and had seen enough of the nomadic life his parents led. For himself, he didn't want that kind of life. He wanted to be a driver, to have less interaction with authority. No matter how much his parents tried to convince him otherwise, insisting that their family was intellectual and sons should follow in their father's footsteps, James responded, "I owe nothing to anyone." To Sophie, it seemed that James' parents liked her. They treated her warmly, asked about her life, her family, and she candidly shared everything with them. Linda once asked her if she planned to continue her education, as being a cook was a physically demanding job and she should aspire for more. In that conversation, James' mother asked Sophie to influence her son and support his entry into the military academy. Sophie promised. Naive. How naive she had been. It was later that James opened her eyes to his parents. "Sophie, my dear Sophie, never tell my parents anything. Everything you say turns against us. When you come over, they pry into your soul. When you leave, they start nagging me that I'm not with the right girl. In their eyes, you're the daughter of an alcoholic and a hysterical mother. And since you grew up in such a family, they think you're hysterical too. After all these conversations, it's better for you not to come to our house anymore. After you leave, they are ready to tear me apart in 1,000 pieces, just to keep us from being together." "What do you tell them?" Sophie almost cried. "Are you going to leave me?" she asked in a trembling voice. "Of course not." James smiled, hugged Sophie, and they kissed. Being together felt so good and sweet to them that they were willing to spend their entire lives like this, kissing and never letting go. "I love you, and I won't give you to anyone else, and no one will break us apart, as long as you wait for me to return from the army." "I'll wait, be sure of that. Just write to me more often. Even if you can't write, I'll wait." "I'll write," James promised, and he wrote. Letters arrived frequently, and the love between Sophie and James grew stronger day by day. But today was different. Apparently, she had to run from her beloved. She couldn't accept it. From that day on, Sophie decided to take a different path through the park, avoiding the main alley. She didn't want to see Larry, who, with his note, aimed to take away the most important thing in her life, the love for James. Sophie was relieved that Doug had been sent to camp for an entire month. Even though it was temporary, he would get a break from their domestic turmoil, and she would be able to take care of herself alone. For this month, she moved in with her grandmother. This month was also a gift to Sophie, as she deeply loved her grandmother. The head chef of the cafeteria where Sophie worked would often give her aromatic, homemade buns for her grandma. Sophie witnessed the joy it brought her grandmother. She carefully unwrapped the treat, brought it to her face, closed her eyes, and inhaled its aroma. "It smells of happiness," her grandmother would say. "Thank you, Sophie, and may God grant health and many years to the one baking this happiness." Sophie smiled at her grandmother's words, and in those moments, she felt happy together with her grandmother. When James returns from his military service, they will immediately file a marriage application and get married. He wrote to her that as soon as they're together, he'll rent an apartment, and they'll live together until the wedding. For Sophie, the wedding is inconsequential. She's ready to live with James without any ceremony. The wedding is for parents, for guests, but she doesn't care as long as James is by her side. James and Doug, those are the only things that matter. She hadn't yet discussed the idea of Doug living with them with James, but for some reason, Sophie was confident that James loves her little brother and will allow Doug to live with them. How happy they will be. Sophie smiled at her dreams, and Doug will be like all the other boys, playing, enjoying life, without fear and trembling from shouts. Sophie is certain they will be happy, but that's for later, when her beloved returns. On the second day after her family moved to the new military housing, James noticed a beautiful girl in their yard. His father had been transferred to this city, and in the last 2 years before his retirement, he had served here, teaching at the aviation school. In the evenings, on the bench where the young people gathered during the day, James saw Sophie for the first time, quiet and not very talkative. While other girls tried to show off in front of the new guy, Sophie stood out by mostly staying silent. If she did say something, her face would turn red. A chubby boy often approached her brother. He would hug her, whisper something in her ear, and when it got dark, Sophie would take the boy's hand, and they would go home. A week later, he gathered his courage and approached Sophie, inviting her to the movies. It was clear from the start that she hadn't expected such attention from a prominent, handsome guy. She blushed, feeling flustered, and not quite believing her ears. She asked again, "Me to the movies? Are you inviting me?" "Yes, I am. Will you go? They say there's an interesting movie, and I'd like to watch it with you." When the movie started, James took Sophie's hand and never let go. Sophie was so excited that she didn't pay much attention to the film. Of course, she glanced at the screen, but the excitement from James's touch overwhelmed her. It was a thrill she couldn't ignore, the essence of the movie, for emotions she had never experienced before. She was in love with James. She realized that the moment she first saw him, but she could never have hoped for his attention. He was her first and, she hoped, only love. Since then, James and Sophie were rarely apart, always together. James always held her hand, as if afraid that if he let go, someone else might take his place. Was he jealous of her? No, there was no reason to be jealous, but the anxiety of losing Sophie never left him. Unlike other guys, James never smelled of alcohol. He didn't even drink beer, and Sophie respected him for that. She felt both love and respect for James simultaneously, and she was happier than she had ever been. Growing up, Sophie had witnessed her drunken father, so she was grateful to fate for bringing James into her life. And soon, very soon, James would return, and they would never be apart again. Sophie's workday began early. At 7 in the morning, she had to leave home about 40 minutes earlier. Luckily, the cafeteria where Sophie worked was a half-hour walk from home, so she didn't need transportation. However, it was frightening to walk through the park early in the morning. Therefore, she had to take a detour around the park. With its cool breath, autumn had already touched nature, and the mornings weren't as bright as in the summer. It felt a bit melancholic, but Sophie's heart was filled with the joy of her impending reunion with James. He was supposed to return any day now, but for some reason, James hadn't specified the exact date in his letters. So, every day, Sophie waited for him. Clip-clop, the sound of Sophie's boot heels echoed. It was morning, and the silence made it feel like the entire neighborhood could hear her walking to work. There weren't many people on the streets at this time. Encountering a passerby was rare, and then she heard it. "Sophie, is that you?" On the opposite side of the street, James was walking. She recognized his voice. "It's me," Sophie yelled, and they rushed toward each other. "Stay right there," James yelled back. He crossed the road, grabbed Sophie in his arms, and kissed her. Sophie was crying, and James continued to kiss her tear-streaked face. "Why are you crying, my dear Sophie, my girl? I'm here with you, don't cry," he whispered. But she couldn't stop. "It's tears of happiness, of joy," Sophie said. "It's like a scene from a movie, James. We were on opposite sides of the street. It was dark, but we recognized each other." "In any darkness, I'll recognize you," James murmured, still holding her tight. Today, Sophie would walk through the park along the main path, and if Larry was there selling fates, she would tell him how happy she was. She hoped that Larry wouldn't miss the last warm days and would be at his usual spot. She wanted to announce to the whole world how happy she was with James, and even more so to Larry. A week had passed since James rented an apartment, and now he and Sophie were living together like a real family. In a month, they would have their wedding and registration, but Sophie was happy even without the wedding. The only person she worried about was Doug. When she started talking to James about Doug moving in with them, her beloved was surprised. "Why, Sophie? Why bring the negativity of the past into our new life? Doug has parents, they'll take care of him, and we might even have our own child soon. That's where our focus should be. Understand me, James. I'm constantly worried about Doug. I shielded him from parental quarrels, and now he's left without me. What are you saying? He's a future man, and nothing will happen to him. He'll toughen up and enter life as a real man, not some weakling. You're a girl, you grew up with your parents, and look at you, independent, smart, and he'll grow too." "James, Doug's mental state is already fragile," Sophie tried to explain. "That's enough," James said sharply. It was the first time he had spoken to Sophie like this, even leaving her taken aback. "Enough, and that's final. I said no. You and I are living our lives, and Doug has his own. Let's end this conversation here, and don't bring this up to me again. And besides, why do you think your parents would agree to your plans? Sophie, this isn't serious. Minors should live with their parents." At that moment, Sophie felt like a traitor. She had betrayed Doug because James wanted it. Her once cloudless happiness was now slightly overshadowed by doubts, but only slightly. Overall, James loved her, and she loved him dearly. As before, Sophie sat down on a bench across from the fate cellar. She felt a bit awkward in front of Larry, as she had been avoiding meeting him all this time. "Sophie," Larry shouted, and Mickey fluttered around on his shoulder. Sophie got up from the bench and approached the fate cellar. "Hello, Larry." The girl smiled. "Did you get offended by Mickey and me?" Sophie didn't answer the question. She smiled and said, "I missed you. Winter is coming, and I won't see you until spring. So I decided to visit you. How's Mickey doing?" "Mickey is doing well. And how's the beautiful girl with the beautiful name Sophie? If you only knew, Larry, how happy I am. James and I are getting married, but we're already living together. We love each other. So, the fate Mickey predicted for me, it seems it's not mine. It belongs to someone else." "God forbid it's yours," Larry said, smiling, but he couldn't hide the sad look from Sophie. "But life, girl, it's long and short at the same time. I wish there's more good in your life, Sophie, and less bad." "I'll always be fine," Sophie confidently stated. "Do you know how much I've endured since childhood? After a gray, cold downpour, we're warmed by the gentle sun, and that's how the sun rose in my life, and I feel warm under its rays. Rain isn't that rare," Larry said. "So, dear, be ready for everything in this life, and try to live it happily. It depends on us too. What about you? Are you happy you're standing here trading fates? Didn't your destiny change when you played the violin in your orchestra? Wasn't it up to you?" "Yes, my destiny took a turn there, but I still play the violin, and I found the strength within me to be happy again. I didn't fall into drinking, like many musicians from our former orchestra did. Against all odds, I'm happy." "And what brings you happiness? You're here standing and selling fates." "Well, yes, this makes me happy. Right now, I'm surrounded by many smiles, by people, and Mickey and I are content not to be alone in this world. Even though these people passing by us might only stop for a few minutes, we don't despair, right, Mickey?" He turned to the monkey. Mickey fidgeted, confirming the violinist's words. "Do you have a family?" For some reason, Sophie wanted to find a flaw in Larry, even just a small one. She felt that only a happy person could sell fates, and Larry wasn't worthy of predicting people's destinies, as he seemed lonely and therefore unhappy. "I had a family. Now, my wife and son live in Canada. They left you. How can you be happy without a family?" "No, they invited me to go with them, but I can't live there. I'm a stranger there, and everything there is foreign to me. Tell me, girl, how many truly happy families have you seen in your life?" Larry asked. Sophie smiled, then fell into thought, trying to recall even one family she knew where everyone was truly happy and content with their lives. She couldn't remember any. Even in her and James's family, there was a but, and that but was her brother Doug, whom she worried about all the time simply because James didn't want Doug to live with them. "That's right," Larry summed up. "Mickey and I are happy. Let me tell you, Sophie, animals are much more loyal and better at understanding humans than some people who not only don't understand each other, but also don't even try." Once again, Larry is right, Sophie thought. James didn't even try to understand how much I'm worried about Doug. He just said no, and that was it. But how is she supposed to live with this decision? James didn't even consider that. "Will you be selling fates again in the spring?" Sophie changed the topic of conversation. "Of course, we will be. Mickey and I enjoy this activity. It was one thing to date James, and quite another to live together." Besides work, Sophie had taken on many responsibilities. Strangely, she felt that she had more of them than James. If she asked him for help, he would brush her off like an annoying fly. "Sophie, I'm under a lot of stress all day. All these household chores are a woman's responsibilities. But I work too. I'm on my feet all day. I get tired. And what about other women? They work and manage everything just fine. You don't need to come to me with this. Handle your women's duties yourself." My mother, with 3 men in the house, managed everything herself. "But it's difficult for me right now." Sophie tried to soften her husband. "I'm constantly nauseous, Reek. Don't worry, you're not the first pregnant woman, and you won't be the last." James sympathized. "In the past, women used to give birth in the fields and then continue working. Nowadays, it's a trend for men to help. Maybe soon they'll even give birth for you." The longer Sophie lived with James, the more she became convinced of Larry's words. Her beloved wasn't listening to her. Had he stopped loving her? "Do you no longer love me?" Sophie would gaze into her husband's eyes. "I don't recognize you, James." "Of course, I love you, Sophie. What do you mean you don't recognize me? I'm still the same. It's you who's different. The hormonal changes from being pregnant. That's why you're nitpicking at everything." He hugged Sophie, trying to calm her down. But she felt uneasy for some reason. This wasn't the life she had imagined with James. To her expression of concern, he said, "Sophie, we can't spend all our time hugging and kissing. Married life isn't moonlit rendezvous. It's not what it used to be when we lived with our moms and dads." "I feel like we're growing apart," Sophie said. "Don't mess with my head," James retorted. "I'm tired from work, so how about getting me something to eat instead?" Sophie went to warm up dinner. Quietly, she cried, knowing that her tears would provoke James' anger. Once, he slapped her for crying and couldn't stop when he demanded it. That slap shattered her hopes of a happy life with James, but she thought that once the baby was born, they would surely be happy. When they had a child, that would be a real family, and she would have that. How she missed Larry now. She couldn't complain to her grandmother. She was ill and pitiable, never needed by her parents. But Larry, she really needed Larry now. She wished for spring to come sooner. Sophie was both scared of and loved James. She was under his complete control. Yet, sometimes, her inner self rebelled against her husband's dictation, but only for a short while, until the next slap from him. She often remembered that fateful note from Larry, but back then, she couldn't believe that the love she shared with James could transform like this. After James had hit Sophie, he would feel guilty for a while and temporarily return to his old self-attentive, affectionate, loving. This would rekindle Sophie's hope that things would get better and everything would be fine. In March, her grandmother fell ill and became bedridden. Her strength was dwindling, and she was fading before their eyes. After work, Sophie would visit her grandmother, wash her, change her diapers, feed her, and then come home late. "Listen, when will you start coming home on time?" James complained. "Your grandmother has a daughter, your mother. She should take care of her, and you should be there to welcome me home from work, prepare dinner, not wandering around wherever." "James, Mom comes in the morning, and I come in the evening. We agreed on that with her." "And did you agree with me?" James was already shouting. "Who's your family? Your mother and grandmother, or me?" but they are also my family. Sophie tried to resist her husband's yelling. They need help. James, the food is always prepared. You just need to warm it up. Is that so difficult? Difficult? I don't want reheated food. I want freshly cooked food. You won't go to your grandmother's anymore. Let your mother take care of her, and in general, you're using these hands to clean up your grandmother's mess, and then you cook food for me. It's disgusting. But I wash my grandmother with gloves, and besides, we have a duty to our family. You have a duty to me. I said you shouldn't go there anymore. Sophie fell silent. She understood that James was at his limit. It wouldn't take much more before he hit her again. Nevertheless, Sophie disobeyed her husband. The next day, after work, she went to her grandmother. If she had known what the consequences of her visit would be, if she had only known, would she have stayed away? No, she still would have gone. Sophie was taking off her shoes in the hallway when James silently approached her and struck her on the head with all his might, not on the cheek, but on the head. It was so unexpected. Sophie didn't even comprehend what had happened, as she lost consciousness for a moment and woke up from the blows, kicked by her husband. Get up. James shouted, get up, or I won't be responsible for myself. Sophie tried to get up, shielding her abdomen from the blows, but James continued to hit her. To prevent him from hitting her in the stomach, she lay face down on the floor and didn't attempt to rise. Finally, he grew tired and, gasping with anger, walked into the kitchen. Get up. He yelled at Sophie, get up and come feed your husband. He heard the front door slam shut and realized that Sophie had fled. Overwhelmed by rage, he rushed out of the apartment and chased after her. However, a man standing by the entrance stopped him, behind whom Sophie had hidden. Help, please help, she whispered. He'll kill me. Don't be afraid, the man calmly said. Usually those who hit women are cowards. He won't dare touch you. James lunged at his wife, but the stranger stopped him with a blow to the face. James hadn't expected this. His eyes turned white with anger. He clenched his fists, ready to retaliate against Sophie's defender, but the man menacingly warned, one more step, and I'll put you down, you monster. James halted, seemingly evaluating his odds against the imposing figure of the stranger. Still fuming and threatening Sophie, he chose to retreat. You better not come home again. I'll ruin you. James spat through gritted teeth. Is this your husband? The man asked. Yes, Sophie said, wiping tears and blood from the cut on her brow. Horrible, the man noted. You can't go back home. You can't live with such a person. Sooner or later, it will end in tragedy. Think about it. Do you have somewhere to go? Yes, I'll go to my grandmother's, but public transportation isn't running now, only taxis. Could you lend me some money? I'll repay you, just leave me your address. Please, believe me, I won't be able to go back home for money, I'm afraid. I believe you, the man assured her. Even if you don't return the money, it won't make me po. I'll return it, Sophie promised. Please, call me a taxi. I rushed out in terror and didn't think to grab my bag. Fear overwhelmed all rational thoughts. The man called a taxi, paid for it, and Sophie headed to her grandmother's. Throughout the taxi ride, she cried incessantly. The concerned taxi driver glanced at Sophie and couldn't help asking, "Are you in distress, miss?" "I am," Sophie sobbed, but she didn't want to share the details of her distress. She needed Larry. It's a shame she didn't know where he lived. If she did, she would have gone to him now, to figure out how to proceed, what to do next. "Who's there?" her grandmother asked, startled. "It's me, Granny. Don't worry," Sophie answered. "What happened, Sophie? Why so late?" "Everything's fine. Don't worry. Just Mom won't be able to come in the morning, and besides, I'll stay with you for a while, Granny. And James doesn't mind. James doesn't mind. Sleep well, my dear." Every part of her body ached and throbbed. There was a bruise on her cheek, a cut on her brow, and her back and legs were covered in bruises. Breathing was painful. Maybe a rib is broken, Sophie thought and burst into tears. She cried not from the pain, but from hurt, from shattered hopes and disbelief in love. This is what follows after what she had with James. Then most likely there's no love. Love that conquers all hardships is only in movies. In life, love transforms into hardships. She cried through the night. In the morning, she called her mother, asking her not to come to her grandmother's place, to give herself time to recover from the pain. She took 3 days off work. Sophie was afraid that James might come to her grandmother's apartment, so she decided that if he appeared, she would call the police. James didn't show up. Perhaps he had a moment of clarity amidst his anger and realized the gravity of his actions, thus avoiding Sophie. The keys to their apartment remained in Sophie's coat pocket. The next day, when her husband left for work, she went to get her things. As she entered the hallway, the first thing she saw was her blood on the floor. He hadn't even bothered to clean up the blood, just walked all over it. Tears streamed down her face as she packed her belongings into bags. She then carried them to the entrance where her brother, Doug, was waiting. "Keep an eye on these things, Doug," Sophie said to her brother. "I'm going to pay a debt to a good person." An 11-year-old girl opened the door and looked at Sophie with curiosity. "Hello, my name is Sophie. A man gave me your address. I don't know his name. He helped me," Sophie explained. "Hello, Daddy's at work," the girl responded with a smile. "My dad's name is Richard. He's like that. He's fair and always helps when he sees someone in need." "It's great to have people like your dad," Sophie said. "Here's the money. Please pass it to Richard and tell him I'm very grateful. If not for him, something terrible might have happened." Mary, Sophie's mother, didn't probe much into why her daughter was staying with her grandmother. She was staying, and that was good. No need to run across the city early in the morning, torn between home and her mother. Sophie would cook, feed her grandmother, and take care of her. Upon learning that Sophie was living with her grandmother, Doug also moved in with them. Sophie called her grandmother to her granddaughter. "I need to talk to you seriously." Sophie approached her grandmother's bed, adjusted her pillow, and sat down beside her. "I see it all, Sophie. I see that you and Dove have nowhere and no one to live with. That's why I want to transfer my apartment to you. Get a notary to help with that. Just make sure your mother doesn't find out. She'll squeeze my apartment out of me. I know after I'm gone, she'll curse me, but I don't care. Let her curse. I'll leave peacefully, knowing that you and Doug will have your own place. Don't abandon him. You're hiding it from me, Sophie, but I've lived my life. I see that things aren't going well with you and James, and you and Doug aren't really needed by your mother. And you, Sophie, don't become like your mother. Don't endure a bad life. It won't lead to anything good. It's better to raise a child on your own than to live on edge with a husband." By the end of March, the grandmother had passed away. Mary immediately started the process of transferring her mother's apartment to herself, only to face an unpleasant surprise. It turned out that the mother had made a gift deed to Sophie. Mary was outraged. "I had plans for this apartment. I wanted to move here with Doug, away from that drunkard, to live in peace, and you ruined it all," Mary yelled. Sophie remained silent, tears streaming down her face. Doug hugged his sister and stammered, shouting at his mother, "Enough, stop yelling. Sophie's going to have a baby, don't yell at her." "Really now?" Mary cursed under her breath. "So live together then, Doug. You've got your roles mixed up. I'm your mother, not Sophie." Mary fumed. "Come back, son, home, or you won't get any money from me." "Sophie," Doug turned to his sister, "can I stay with you? I'll help you. Can I?" "Stay. Of course, stay, Doug," Sophie replied. "I'll see how you two manage to survive on Sophie's meager salary," Mary screeched before storming out, slamming the door loudly. With her grandmother's illness, her passing, the hustle and bustle of arrangements, and the sorrow of love's disappointment, Sophie's pain slightly subsided. However, alongside the cruelty of James, she admitted to herself that she loved him and missed him. A week after the scandal, Mary showed up at her daughter and son's place. Seeing her mother, Sophie expected to hear cries and curses, which were typical of Mary, but she was mistaken. On the contrary, her mother brought 2 bags of groceries, new jeans for Doug, and a summer maternity dress for Sophie. Mary acted as if there hadn't been that tantrum she threw last week. This kind of visit from her mother scared Sophie more than if she had stormed in with a scandal. Sophie immediately sensed something was amiss. "How are you two here?" Mary began her monologue. Sophie, you've lost weight. Are you not eating well? You're pregnant. You need to eat better. I'm eating fine, and I'm gaining weight, so everything's normal, Sophie replied. How's school, Doug? She turned to her son. Good, I have good grades. Mary noted for herself that Doug had stopped stuttering, but she didn't dwell on it. She didn't come here to rejoice in Sophie and Doug's lives. She needed to set her daughter straight, to make her return to her husband and live a married life. Besides, if Sophie moved back, it would free up the apartment, and Mary could move in with Doug. I see that everything's fine with you, but Sophie, it's not right to have a child and raise them without a father, Mary said, sipping her tea. It's not like it did us any good growing up with both parents, with your fights echoing through the neighborhood, Sophie retorted to her mother. Mary raised her right eyebrow in surprise. She didn't know this side of Sophie. The quiet, docile Sophie had never reproached her or Brent for anything. And here she was, speaking up now that she had her own place. She had become so independent. Mary didn't like it, but she didn't show that she was surprised by her daughter's words. Taking quick sips of her hot tea, she continued her prepared speech. I've spent my whole life trying to keep our family together. And then, where could we go? Sophie, you know yourself. It's your father's apartment, and wandering through rental flats. I didn't have the means for that, and I still don't. Sophie remained silent, not wanting to delve into this topic. She knew that arguing with her mother would only harm herself if a scandal erupted. It would be a spectacle. Sometimes, Sophie felt that her father turned to alcohol because of her mother's unbearable character. He was a weak man, always silent when her mother yelled. Both Doug and Sophie feared her mother's outbursts more than their quiet, drunk father. I met James in our yard. He was on his way to his parents', Mary continued. We talked, and he didn't even know that we had buried Grandma. He was so polite, a nice young man. He expressed his condolences to me. I can't understand what happened between you two. What happened that made you decide to raise a child without a father? And what about you, Mom? Didn't you ask him? I wonder what he would say to you. Would you really believe him? Sophie retorted. I did ask him. He said he feels really guilty towards you and regrets what he's done. He doesn't dare to come to you with his guilt. He's afraid you won't forgive him. Sophie remained silent, desperately wanting to believe that James was remorseful. She wished it so badly, for she loved him deeply and missed him. Let me tell you, daughter, you have to learn to forgive each other. A guilty head doesn't need a noose. Get back together with James and live your life. What good is it to be a single mother from now on? It's wrong. It's not good for a woman to be alone. Anyone can hurt her. It hurts even more when those you love hurt you, Sophie said. And by the way, whatever James told you, he said it to you. He didn't come to me, and he didn't apologize. And if he does apologize, will you forgive him? Mary asked. Sophie shrugged uncertainly, and Mary understood that she probably would forgive him. James waited for Sophie outside the cafeteria. He was nervous, repeatedly clenching and unclenching the hand that held a bouquet of roses for his wife. Accidentally pricking his palm, Sophie's workday had ended, but for some reason, she hadn't shown up yet. But then, the cafeteria door opened, and his wife emerged with two women. He grew even more tense. Sophie, James called out. Hearing her beloved's voice, she startled and paused. The two women, upon seeing Sophie's husband with the bouquet, smiled understandingly and continued on their way. Hey, these are for you, James said. She took the roses, silently and warily eyeing him. Sophie, forgive me, you fool, forgive me. There won't be a repeat of such a thing. I swear, it won't happen again. Do you believe me, Sophie? Why are you silent? Do you believe? Sophie remained silent. Would you like me to get on my knees? Just forgive me. No need to get on your knees, Sophie said. The main thing is for you to believe in what you're swearing right now. I'm a man of my word, and I'll keep it. Believe me, I love you, and I can't be without you. She desperately wanted to believe James, and she did believe him. Let's go home, Sophie. He hugged her and kissed her. She didn't resist the kiss, and he understood that Sophie forgave him. My grandmother gave me her apartment. Sophie smiled. Now we won't have to rent a place. Doug will live with us. Sophie, forgive me, but we have our own home. It may be a rental, but I feel confident there. Let's keep living where we were. Don't worry, my love. A little more time and I'll buy an apartment on a mortgage, and maybe we'll sell Grandma's apartment later. I can't live in a one-bedroom with Doug. How would we manage? But what about Doug? Sophie asked, disappointed. You probably know, I talked to Mary. She wanted to live with Doug, so let them stay there for now, and we'll see what happens. After the separation of Sophie and James, one could say that their honeymoon period began. James remained as loving, attentive, and affectionate as he was before marriage, during their first month of living together, and now as well. That was the miracle of it. Love, Sophie believed, was the greatest miracle on earth, and she didn't regret forgiving her husband one bit. She was happy, and when someone is happy, they forget about the bad things. Ahead of them lay only good things, and she was at peace about Doug. Sometimes, Sophie felt that her mother couldn't conceive of her life without scandals. It was as though she was recharged by them. Sophie sometimes visited her father briefly, fearing James's reaction to her absence. She understood that she needed to be home before her husband's return, and was now at ease with that understanding. She pitied her father. After all, he was still her father. Daughter, Sophie, her drunk father cried, I'm so glad you come. Doug often drops by after school, sometimes to the parking lot. When I have money, I give some to him. Here, take it. Her father handed her a crumpled $10 bill. Take it, my dear. There's nothing more for now. No need, Dad, no need. I don't need it. James and I have everything we need. No need. Take it, please. I'll just drink it away anyway, and I need it for my soul. You're my children, her father cried, not holding back his tears. Just don't forget about me with Doug. I have no one else but you. Mary left me, and I'm just happy about that. I've hidden the plates, so it's quieter now. Sophie felt sorry for her father. The way she interacts with him now, they didn't used to talk like this before. Due to her mother's scandals, they barely saw each other. Could it be that their terrible life was caused by their mother's quarrelsome nature, or was it her drunken father all along? It's unclear who's right, who's to blame. How complicated life is, which is why Sophie needs to fight for her family so that she and James don't end up with a life like her parents, and so their child with James doesn't run away from home like Doug did. Sophie saw that James was trying to be reserved. She saw that sometimes he lost his temper, but he wants and can overcome his demons, and Sophie appreciates that. She's trying to argue with her husband less. She takes on more household chores, comes home earlier than James, greets him, feeds him dinner. Everything is good with them. You can't imagine anything better. Spring finally defeated the snow and ice. Buds appeared on trees, and people flocked to nature, to the park. Perhaps Larry and Mickey are out on the avenue selling destinies. Sophie thought, smiling at her thoughts. After work today, I'll go to the main avenue of the park. I want to meet Larry, to talk. He was a stranger in a way, this violinist, but for some reason, Sophie felt drawn to him. No one had ever spoken to her as openly and wisely as Larry did. It seemed to her that God himself sent her this person, which is why Sophie considered Larry her personal apostle. He wasn't an apostle to anyone else, but to her, he was like a real apostle. Her grandmother used to tell her that nothing happens in this life without God's will. So was her encounter with the destiny merchant a divine plan? And if so, was it also God's will when James used to beat her? Sophie had accumulated many questions, and she wanted to discuss them with Larry. Sophie was disappointed to not find Larry on the main avenue of the park. Perhaps Larry doesn't linger outside for long, she thought. It's still quite chilly, and it gets dark early. James worked on Saturdays, but she had the day off. In order to meet Larry, she decided to take a walk in the park on Saturday, getting some fresh air while she was at it. She needed to walk more often these days. As long as Larry and Mickey were doing well, as long as they were alive and healthy, they would definitely meet. Sophie didn't meet Larry, but in the courtyard, she ran into Richard. Sophie recognized him immediately, even though that night she was in shock and frightened. But she remembered the face of her defender. Her memory for faces had always been excellent. However, Richard didn't recognize her at all. Good evening, Sophie greeted Richard. He looked at her with interest. but it was clear that he didn't recognize her. How could he? After all, on that night, Sophie looked completely different, with a frightened, hunted gaze like a cornered animal. Half of her face blue, her eyebrow split. Richard tilted his head to the left, smiling, trying to remember who this pregnant girl was and where he might have seen her. Don't remember, Sophie smiled. Did my daughter give you money for the taxi? I came to repay the debt, but you weren't home. Whoa, is that you? I didn't recognize you, Richard said. You could have skipped returning the debt, it wasn't a significant amount. I wanted to thank you again, Richard, but I couldn't. You weren't at home. You can thank me now, he smiled. Sophie felt embarrassed and blushed. Just kidding, Richard said. And you, Sophie? And you, Sophie, did you forgive your husband? Or am I mistaken? Sophie blushed even more. Why is that any of your business? She found herself getting irritated for some reason. Generally, it's none of my business about your life. I feel sorry for you and your future child. Richard gestured towards Sophie's belly. What are you so impulsive, Sophie? Why so unyielding? You're being trampled on, beaten, and yet you forgive. Horror, utter horror. A complete stranger is saying this to her. How can he? How dare he? Richard seemed to have heard her thoughts. I can and I dare, Richard said. I can because I know how such family lives and I've seen enough. Surprised where I've seen all this. Sophie remained silent, even afraid to think about anything. It seemed like Richard could see right through her. I work at the police. That's where I've seen it all. I know, Richard sighed. You shouldn't frighten pregnant women, but right now, I want to scare you. I want you to understand the reality you're living in. He'll kill you, Sophie. In the best case, he'll cripple you. In the worst, even worse, because he might cripple you so badly that you won't be able to stand on your feet again. Or you'll end up in a mental institution. And where will your child be? Have you thought about that? I suggest you do. Richard didn't say anything more. He walked towards his entrance without looking back, waved his hand to Sophie without turning around. Surprisingly, when Sophie got home, James was already there. She was afraid that a quarrel would start now, so she started justifying herself. I'm on time. It's you who came home early today. Everything is ready. I'll cook pasta now, and the side dish is already done, she said. The car broke down. It's been in the repair shop since Monday, James said. He was looking at Sophie strangely, and a shiver ran down her spine from his gaze. She felt short of breath. She changed into her home robe, while James stood there, casting a sidelong glance at her. Who's the guy you were chatting so amiably with in the courtyard? He asked. Sophie didn't know what to say. Oh, just an acquaintance, she said, the first thing that came to mind, and went into the kitchen. Don't lie to me, he said through gritted teeth. I saw you smiling at him. James swung his hand, and Sophie recoiled and fell onto the stove. The nylon robe immediately caught fire, and Sophie screamed in pain. James quickly realized what happened. He poured water from a pot onto his wife and started pulling the wet robe off her. The sleeve of the robe caught fire, so the skin from her wrist to her shoulder turned into a blistered mess, with fragments of melted nylon sticking to it in places. The pain was excruciating. Sophie wanted to scream, but she could only moan and plead. Call an ambulance. Please call an ambulance. Sophie was taken to the hospital, to the burn unit. The pain was too intense for her to think, to analyze how all this happened. Right now, she feels like she imagined that James raised his hand over her and she got scared. She was simply frightened, so she's at fault for what happened. He didn't hit her, didn't push her. She fell onto the stove by herself. My dear Sophie, James stroked her hair. How careless you are. Did you get dizzy? How did you end up falling? It seemed like you were going to hit me, and I was trying to dodge your fist, she said. The two women who shared the room with Sophie found the conversation between Sophie and her husband too personal, so they left the room. Only Sophie's roommate remained, as she was hooked up to him for. But I promised you, you just thought you saw something. James deceived her. He wanted to hit his wife, but her robe caught fire, and he knew it perfectly well. However, Sophie insisted otherwise. It was easy to convince her of this because she wanted to believe it. Sophie, I'm sorry, But I had to overhear everything you were talking about with your husband, said the woman who stayed in the room. He's lying. I can see such bastards through and through. I lived with one for 14 years, thinking he would change, and yours won't change. Listen to me, kiddo. Divorce him before he kills you. He strangled you. It's obvious even from the outside, and it's clear you're afraid of him. Sophie didn't like that a stranger was giving her advice. She found this conversation unpleasant. So, she said, it's between James and me. We'll sort it out ourselves. In her mind, she added, too many advisors lately. People sticking their noses where they shouldn't. Sophie, how did this happen? Are you in pain? It doesn't hurt anymore, Sophie replied. They gave me painkillers. Wow, Sophie, you really know how to make an entrance. Dig's mother entered the room after him. A spitting image of your father, always finding adventures for your backside. And now what? You're pregnant and have to get injections. Not good for the baby. Hello, Mom. Thanks for the support, Sophie said. And don't you get sassy with your mother, or so help me. I've noticed you've been quite chatty lately. Are you talking to your husband like that too? If so, no wonder you're having all these fights. Mom, what's gotten into you? What did I say? Haven't you had an argument with anyone for a while? Here's some broth, chicken with potatoes. Doug and I are leaving, Mary said indignantly. I'll stay with Sophie, Doug said. I'll come on my own. Suit yourself, Mary said, sounding offended. To change the topic, how's Dad doing? Sophie asked to lighten the mood. Same as always, in his usual condition. Her mother brightened up. He was itching to come to see you. I stopped him. No need for him to disgrace you, showing up with a drunken face. If you need anything, Sophie, give me a call. Either I or Doug will bring whatever you need. Thanks, Mom, Sophie replied. She didn't want to argue with anyone right now, but arguing with her mother was almost impossible. After a 2-week stay in the hospital, Sophie returned home. James practically carried her in his arms, and she was floating on cloud 9 from happiness. Her arm was a bit sore, but not critically so. As long as her belly was still small, she could tidy up the apartment, and then both she and the baby needed fresh air. And where else but in the park could she find that air? Finally, the true spring weather had returned when it was more enticing to be outside than indoors. Around this time last year, she had met Larry. Most likely, the fate traders were in full swing today, and she was bound to meet the violinist and his friend Mickey, who's come to visit us. Larry grinned at Sophie. Mickey got busy and clapped her hands. That's right, Mickey. It's a beautiful girl with a beautiful name, Sophie. And Mickey and I missed you, Sophie. And I missed you a lot. Sophie smiled and hugged Larry. Mickey got even busier, jumped onto Sophie's arms and hugged her. Recognized, Larry said. Mickey has a good memory. I was worried I might not meet you, Sophie confessed. I came here before, but you weren't around. I thought maybe you'd gone to Canada to your wife and son. How good and pleasant it was for Sophie to talk and joke with Larry. With the appearance of the violinist, it was as if she had taken a breath of fresh spring air, the kind that brought her back to her senses, true senses. How easy it was with good people, easy and joyful. So, how are things with you, Sophie? Larry asked. Everything's fine. Fine is an empty word, the violinist said. You're so young and about to become a mother. Everything should be wonderful for you. Sophie was silent. She was afraid to admit to Larry that in this short period, she had lived an entire lifetime. What hadn't happened in these 6 months that had turned her whole concept of love, family life, everything, upside down? In half a year, she had grown up, but not stiffened up. She had become even weaker than before. But she didn't need to tell all of this to Larry. He could already see that Sophie was cornered. She knew her place, where she had been put. Her sad eyes spoke of it, her drooping shoulders, the hopelessness in every movement. When she had said it like that, Larry understood that behind that word, there was no emptiness, there was an abyss, into which Sophie was being pushed, and she was balancing on the edge of this very abyss, trying to hold on, but her strength was fading. Don't want to talk to me, don't talk, girl. I can see it without words. Things aren't easy for you. Remember the prediction. Run from the person who means more to you than anyone else in the world. Sophie, run. Hear me, kid. Save yourself. Sophie had talked to Larry, and she felt so good, yet uneasy. Why did she believe in her personal apostle? Why, after speaking with him, did she suddenly feel like she saw the truth and understood that her husband was a danger? She also realized that if her robe hadn't caught fire, he would have hit her. She's sure of that now. What to expect from James and when? Or should she not wait, but run? Where to run? Right now, she understood that her fear was stronger than her love for James. Run, girl, run. Larry had told her, and she believed him, heard him. But how to tell James she was scared of him, that she wanted to leave, to divorce? If she told him, his reaction would be predictable, and Sophie feared that reaction. But she would still have to say it. Or should she leave quietly, disappear? No, that wouldn't work. He'd find her, and it would be even worse. Worse than that terrible day. Probably not. So she needed to make a decision, to speak up. James came home from work in a good mood. He was talking to Sophie about something related to work, but she didn't hear him. Her mind was focused on one thing: how to tell James that she was leaving him. How to say it. She had decided to go live with her father, not wanting to compete with her mother for the apartment. If she left secretly, James would find her there too, and he might even ambush her at work. That would be even worse. Sophie, what's with you? James asked. I'm talking to you, and you're not reacting at all, as if you're somewhere in the clouds. I need to tell you something. It's important. Sophie began, stumbling over her words. I'm leaving you. What? James interrupted her, clearly not expecting such a turn of events. What did you say? Or did I mishear? James, understand. Our family is a mistake. How could she dare say this to him? James was changing right before her eyes. His blue eyes turned dark with anger. His fists clenched and unclenched on their own. Sophie stood up from the couch, intending to walk to the hallway, get dressed, and leave. She'd collect her things later. She turned her back to her husband, and he grabbed her by the hair. What do you think you're doing, you piece of shit? Playing games with me? Where are you going? Who's waiting for you? Is it that guy you were fawning over? Let go. Sophie screamed in pain. What guy? I want to leave you. Let go. I'm scared of you. Be scared, you piece of shit. Be scared. There's no other way to deal with trash like you. You're just a promiscuous woman who can only be straightened out with a fist. He hit her in the face, knocking her off her feet, dragged her by the hair to the hallway, and there he started kicking her. His anger had consumed him entirely. How dare she say something like that? How dare she think of leaving him without his permission? Sophie couldn't get up to escape. He wouldn't let her. Finally, he grew tired, but he remembered that she had escaped from him last time. So, this time he locked the door and put the key in his pocket. Get up, you piece of shit. James yelled from the other room. Go wash yourself, clean up after yourself, and feed your husband. Sophie didn't react to her husband's words. James came out to the hallway and saw his wife unconscious, the lower part of her robe soaked in blood. Did I beat her badly? Is she that fragile? He thought. He was scared God forbid she dies, and he ends up in prison. An ambulance arrived quickly. What happened? The doctor asked. I don't know. I came home from work, and she was lying here, James replied. He needed to warn this wretch that if she even squeaked, opened her mouth and said something, she wouldn't live. She's easily intimidated. She fears herself. But look at her, planning to leave him. From me, you'll only go forward with your feet, James thought. Just try to utter a word about divorce. James sat next to Sophie when she regained consciousness. Seeing him, she got scared and even screamed, drawing the attention of the women in the ward. Shut up, James whispered almost in her ear. Shut up and listen. Just mutter to someone that I beat you. It will get worse. Got it? I don't hear you. Got it? I got it, Sophie whispered, and suddenly she realized she no longer felt the baby inside her. The baby, Sophie gasped. My baby, it's no longer there, James said, feigning sorrow. Sophie burst into tears, and James whispered to her, You've deprived us of the child, and then said more audibly for the ward to hear, Sophie, don't cry, it just happened, no one's to blame. We'll have another child, my dear, my sweet girl. He wanted to comfort her like before, to stroke her head, But Sophie pulled her head away from his hand, groaned in pain, turned away from him, and cried, "Get well, Sophie. I'll come by in the evening. What should I bring you?" She remained silent. I asked. James whispered threateningly in her ear. "Nothing." Sophie barely moved her swollen lips. "Go away and don't come back." "I'll decide what to do myself," her husband whispered. "Don't tell me what to do, and keep your mouth shut. Think of what you'll tell the police. Doctors are obligated to report your injuries to the police. Just try to open your mouth." He stood up and left. Sophie both hated and feared him. He killed their baby, and for her, it was such a shock. Richard had warned her, had told her to think about the child. Now there won't be a baby. No one to think about except herself. He might even kill her. "Did he beat you?" the grandmother in the ward asked. "No, not him," Sophie said fearfully. "I don't know. I don't remember." The other two women in the ward looked at Sophie with pity and shook their heads disapprovingly. "The investigator will come to you. What will you say? Will you cover for him? He killed your child, and he might eventually kill you too." Sophie remained silent, and the grandmother seemed to want to vent. "The police came to me too, asking all sorts of questions," the old woman said. "I told them I fell in the basement. I couldn't turn in my son, my own flesh and blood. Don't you have anyone, son, brother, father? But he's no one to you, just your tormentor. You need to confess to the investigator." Sophie didn't respond to the unfortunate old woman's rant. She pitied her. Her son was abusing her. Where was the world headed if a loving son could beat his own mother? What could they say about her then? "Will you deny that your husband beat you?" the investigator asked. "How come you can't remember what happened to you? You remember everything, Sophie, but for some reason, you're covering up this crime, and it is a crime, and you could go to jail for it." "Could," Sophie thought. "And if they don't, then James will finish her off." "No, she can't confess." "I don't remember anything," Sophie repeated. "Well, if that's how it is, so be it. Goodbye, Sophie. I hope you've drawn your conclusions, and we won't meet again." "I have," Sophie replied. "I hope we won't meet again." After lunch, 10 days after her hospitalization, Sophie was discharged and returned home to her father. "Dad, I want to live with you for a while. Are you okay with that?" Sophie was packing her things into bags, and her slightly tipsy father stared at her in confusion. "No, I'm not against it," he replied. "But what happened, Sophie?" His gaze fell on his daughter's flat stomach, and he fell silent, rushing to the hallway for the rest of her belongings. "I wanted to talk to you and Mom. I called you, told you everything was fine, but nothing was fine. I came straight to you from the hospital. He beat me, Dad, so badly that I lost the baby." "Sweetheart," her father rushed to Sophie, hugged her, and led her into the room. "This is horrifying, what you're saying. How can someone beat another person? A pregnant woman at that. Was he drunk?" "He doesn't drink, Dad, you know that. It's not the first time he's beaten me, but I thought it would change. He promised me it wouldn't happen again, but it didn't last long." "Well, it's good you left him. I'm glad you came to me. It means I'm still good for something." "Does Mom know you're here?" "No, she doesn't know. I'm not ready to listen to her right now, to hear her say it's all my fault. It's always everyone's fault in her eyes. Well, never mind, she'll find out. Make yourself at home, Sophie. There are 2 rooms available, and I'm in the living room. There's a TV here." "Thank you, Dad, thank you. But Sophie, I must say, it's not very clean here." Her father smiled, "Just like it is at most guys' places." "Don't worry, Dad, I'll clean up. There's food. Mary brought some groceries. If you want, you can cook something. There's chicken and fish in the freezer." "Don't worry, Dad. I'm not in the mood for food right now." No, Sophie, you need to eat. You need to regain your strength after the hospital. Maybe you want something. I'll run to the store. I want some coffee and cheese. There's coffee on the table, instant though, and I'll get the cheese. What kind do you like? Her father bustled. "Any kind, Dad." Her father was so joyful. Sophie hadn't seen him like this in a while. He hugged her often, comforting her. "You have a whole life ahead of you, Sophie. It's good you got away from James in time, and I'm glad you came to me. Where else would I go, Dad? Well, you did inherit your grandmother's apartment. Dad, you know how to reach Mom. Let them live there with Doug. I'll stay with you. It's more peaceful for me this way. That's true. Sophie and her father embraced, but their moment was interrupted by a knock on the door. Are you expecting someone, Dad? Sophie asked nervously. No, I'm not. Maybe your mother decided to drop by. Mom has her own key, though. True, Brent replied with confusion. No one usually comes to my place. I don't know who it could be. It could be James. I'm scared, Dad. I'm really scared. He's been calling me multiple times, and I haven't answered. He's looking for me. I'm sure it's him. There was another knock on the door, followed by insistent pounding. Brent stood up, walked over to the door, and peered through the peephole. Don't open it, Dad, Sophie whispered fearfully. I'm sure it's him. I'll just take a look, Sophie. Brent leaned against the door, and the knocking grew stronger. They heard James's voice. Open up. Sophie shook her head, signaling to her father not to even think about opening the door. If you don't open up, things will get worse, James yelled through the door. Sophie, it's better for you if you open up right away. I'll find you no matter what, and then I'll make sure you regret it. I'll call the police, Brent told his son-in-law. It's better if you leave peacefully. Sophie and I will file a report against you. Your threats and harassment won't go unnoticed. What harassment? She's my wife, and she's supposed to be with me. Open the door now. What on earth is going on? Brent heard a neighbor's voice. If you don't shut up and leave, I'll throw you down the stairs. Evidently, the neighbor was addressing her son-in-law, Shane, as it seemed that James's shouting had annoyed him enough to step in and restore order. None of your business. Close the door from your side, James retorted. Not my business, the neighbor asked. Without saying another word, he approached James, landed a punch between his eyes, grabbed him by the collar, and tossed him down the stairs. If I hear any more of your nonsense here, things will get worse, the neighbor threatened before retreating into his own apartment. Brent had been watching everything through the peephole. He won't come back here, her father said confidently. You know, Sophie, with our neighbor Shane, you shouldn't mess around. Brent didn't finish his sentence about the neighbor. He saw Sophie crying and trembling in fear. Don't worry, he's gone. Her father rushed to reassure her. He definitely won't come back here now. Calm down. What's got you so worked up? Brent wrapped his daughter in a blanket and brought her a cup of hot tea. Have some hot tea, Sophie. It'll calm your nerves. Dad, he's going to ambush me at work, Sophie said, sipping the hot tea and flinching with each gulp. What can you do? You know how he gets when he's angry. I'll meet you after work, don't worry. But what can you do? Do you know what he's capable of when he's furious? Tomorrow, Sophie, when we wake up, we'll go to the police, file a report against him for his threats and harassment. I was actually planning to file for divorce tomorrow, and you will. I'll come over after my shift, and we'll go to the police together. I'll be there with you. Sophie calmed down a bit as her father left for work, and she tried to sleep. Sleep didn't come easily. She listened to the sounds outside her door and replayed her short time living with James in her head. She realized she was more terrified of him than anyone or anything she had ever feared before. Outside, darkness had fallen completely, intensifying Sophie's anxiety. She turned on all the lights in the apartment and, without realizing it, drifted off to sleep. Early in the morning, the sound of a door lock being scraped woke her up. Sophie jumped out of bed and hid behind the wardrobe. Sophie let out a sigh of relief and smiled to herself as her mother entered. Hey, Mom. Sophie emerged from her hiding spot. Oh my God. Oh, goodness gracious, Sophie, you scared me. Mary sat down on the couch and, clutching her heart, scolded. Why are you up so early? Did you tidy up the apartment? I cleaned up. I left James. I'm going to live here, Sophie replied. You left? What about? Do I need to vacate Grandma's apartment? Mary was alarmed. No, Mom. No need to vacate it. You live there with Doug, and I'll be here with Dad. Mary sighed in relief, but still insisted on an answer regarding leaving James. I came here from the hospital, to Dad. He beat me up, and I lost the baby. Only now did Mary notice that her daughter's belly was gone. He killed our baby. What else is there to expect, Mom? Something doesn't seem right about this being James. Maybe you pushed him too far, Mary suggested. Mom, so it doesn't seem like him, but I seem like the one who pushed him to this. What are you saying? And what can lead to getting beaten up, beaten to the point where you lose consciousness? Mary fell silent. After a few minutes, she spoke again. Well, don't worry, Sophie. Maybe things will get better. Every family has its ups and downs. I'm not planning to make things better, Mom. Do you even hear yourself? He's beating me. He killed our child. And you're talking about making things better. I'm filing for divorce today. He was here last night, threatening me. He was ready to break the door down just to get to me. He said he'd decapitate me anyway. Sophie, you can't take his words so literally. Don't rush into divorce. I know people who got divorced on impulse and then ended up remarrying. People change their minds. I'll never, hear me, Mom, I'll never be with him again. Since when did you become so proud? You're all about breaking up. Those words, never and always, forget about them. They won't serve you well in life. Enough, Mom. Your advice doesn't suit me. Thank God there are people I trust more than you. Who are these people, envious ones, or did you join some cult? I got into dependence on James. I got into his slavery. Wow, Mary chuckled. You're throwing around some dramatic words, like in a TV show. Sophie didn't respond to that. She understood that her mother was on the verge of shouting. She walked into the room she had settled in and firmly closed the door. Why are you shutting the door on your mother? Mary was already yelling. I'm still in my own apartment, and you have no right to slam doors in front of me. In that case, please vacate my apartment, Sophie calmly said. Mary fell silent instantly. If you come here and start yelling, you'll find yourself back home, Mom, while I'll go to my own apartment. Is that an arrangement that works for you? If it is, then welcome home. Okay, that's enough talking, Mary said in a calm tone. I need to get to work. What are you planning to report? The police officer on duty asked. Were you assaulted? Were you killed? Was something stolen from you? No, the duty officer answered himself. Then what's the report about? But he's been harassing me, threatening me, Sophie replied. I confirmed that. Brent supported his daughter. He came yesterday, knocked and threatened. But what exactly has he done? What are you supposed to wait for before he does something? Sophie asked. He's your husband, and therefore, whatever he might have said to you, no one will accept any complaints from you. So, my dear girl, deal with your husband livingly and don't distract us from our work. And if something ever does happen, call the police, file a complaint. But for now, I'm not detaining you. Goodbye. So, Dad, it seems I need to be killed. My head needs to be severed. Then we'll call the police. What should I do? We'll figure something out, Sophie. We'll come up with a plan. Hello, Larry. Sophie smiled. Sophie, our beauty. Hello. How are you? How's your health? Where's your assistant? Sophie was surprised. Where's Mickey? My Mickey fell ill. Larry replied, tears welling up in his eyes. Is it something serious? Sophie asked, concerned. I hope not. We went to the veterinary clinic. They did an ultrasound, and it doesn't seem to be anything major. Maybe she ate something she shouldn't have, an intestinal upset. People around here tend to feed her all sorts of things. Maybe I should ban them from feeding her. God forbid anything happens to Mickey. I can't bear being alone. She's like a child to me. Larry tried to hold back his tears, but they flowed naturally. Oh, come on, Larry. I'm sure Mickey will recover. Sophie hurried to reassure him. And how long are you going to work? What's work without Mickey? Besides, all my thoughts are at home, with my little one. I live nearby, about a 7-minute walk, Larry said. I'm glad you came to visit me today, Sophie. I started feeling scared, without anyone's support. But then you said everything would be fine, and Mickey would get better. I believed you, and it made me feel better. Here she was coming to Larry with her fears, and he too was going through a rough period. He was just as human as she was, and he was scared too. Mickey tried to show enthusiasm about her owner's arrival and Sophie's presence, but she quickly grew quiet, her eyes looking as pitiful as those of a sick child. Sophie picked at the monkey and realized that Mickey was weakened. She lacked her usual vigor and energy. My darling, My good girl. Sophie stroked Mickey's head. The monkey rested its head on Sophie's shoulder and just stayed silent. Dehydration, Larry said. We need to administer 4 fluids, but we don't have the money. I'll help, Sophie said. I have money. How much do you need? Take it from me. I don't know, Sophie, when I'll be able to pay you back. You don't need to pay me back. I'm happy to help. You've helped me, and others have helped me in difficult times. She suddenly remembered Richard's assistance. Do you want me to stay here for a while? I'm on sick leave until the end of the week. That would actually be great, Larry responded. I could work peacefully, not worrying about Mickey. She wouldn't be alone, and I could earn some money to pay you back, Sophie. And you, why are you on sick leave? I saw you in the park. Is something wrong with your child, Sophie? Is everything so bad? That's a long story, Larry. Right now, I'll call Yvette and have them come to administer the 4 for Mickey. I'll quickly go home, let my dad know I'll be staying here, and grab a few things. You're our savior, dear. You've saved us. Larry smiled and teared up. To us, you're like an angel sent by God. And to me, Larry, you're the one sent by God. Mickey fell asleep after the 4, and Larry and Sophie talked for a long time. Sophie shared every detail of her life with James with the violinist. My poor girl, Larry said, frowning. You should have paid attention to that note. Sometimes, in one way or another, we receive hints from above, but we often brush them off, thinking that everything in this life depends on us. It's not everything, not really. Well, what's done is done. Now we need to somehow keep James away from you. I understand that someone like him can only be stopped with force. Where should you seek protection, Sophie? I understand, both your father and I. What kind of protectors are we against a strong, young, and angry man? Maybe you should come live with me permanently and change your workplace so he won't find you. I thought about that, but then, if I hide, he'll keep searching for me until he finds me. And here you're right, Sophie. Maybe, dear, it's better for now that you stay with Larry, her father suggested. And who's this Larry? He asked. He's my apostle, Sophie smiled. He's a very kind person, but very lonely. His monkey, Mickey, got sick, and he needs to work, but there's no one to watch over her, take care of her, so I offered Larry my help. Mickey's, her father was surprised. That's an unusual name. And why suddenly call Larry an apostle? And how old is he? Could you have developed feelings for him? He raised his eyebrows. Dad, Mickey is a little monkey, cute but sad right now because she's sick. And Larry is an older man, and I couldn't have developed feelings for him. He's the one who sells destiny in the park, those colorful envelopes where your destiny is predicted. I got to know him that way. He's good, but a very lonely person, and I call him apostle for myself. He can advise, and I understand him. Hear him, Dad. He's a very wise person. When I met him, I drew a note from his drum, and it said that I should run away from James, but I didn't believe it. Turns out I was wrong not to. Now I get it. I was getting worried. Hadn't heard anything about Larry. And then, I didn't want to tell you, Sophie, her father sighed. But I think it's better to be in the know about everything and not hide from the truth. Yesterday evening, James came to my workplace, caused a scene, tried to force me to tell him where you were. But it didn't go as he planned. The drivers there at the parking lot were having a drink, heard the commotion, and rushed to help. He got quite a beating. He won't be showing up at my workplace again. Oh gad, he'll become even angrier because of this. No, Sophie, with people like him, that's the only way. After the 4, Mickey perked up, which brought joy to both Larry and Sophie. However, something else was troubling Sophie. Next week, she had to return to work, and the divorce hearing was on Friday. That's when she would have to meet James. Just thinking about it made her break out in a sweat. But there was nothing she could do. She had to face it. Sophie, how about I pick you up from work? Larry suggested. Oh, no, I'm afraid for you. I'm afraid for myself, and now I'd be worried about you as well. I thought for a long time whether it's appropriate to burden people with my problems, but I'll overcome myself and still turn to someone who once helped me. Maybe he won't refuse now. He works in the police, but he lives in the same yard as my husband. I'm afraid of running into James there. I'll accompany you, Larry said. And if anything happens, we'll make some noise. Hopefully, people in the houses will respond to the commotion. As statistics show, if you shout for help, no one will come out. But if you shout fire, Sophie smiled, then yes, some might come out. We'll shout fire if needed. Larry smiled in response. Sophie knocked on Richard's door, but there was no answer. It was getting late, and it was dark outside. However, the police had irregular working hours, so it was uncertain when Richard would show up. Where was his daughter? Where was his wife? Someone should be home. Let's wait in the courtyard, Larry suggested. Otherwise, people might start wondering why we're standing in the hallway. That's true, but we need to be careful when leaving so that we don't run into James. As they were leaving the hallway, they came face to face with Richard. Sophie, Richard smiled. Good evening. He politely nodded to Larry. Larry, he extended his hand to the young violinist, Sophie's friend. Back to thank me again. Richard turned to Sophie, still smiling. Richard's smile faded when he looked into Sophie's eyes, filled with fear and concern. Something happened again, he asked. I need to talk to you, really talk, Sophie replied. I'm sorry, it's quite late, and I know you're tired from work, but still. Nonsense, Richard answered. Let's go to my place. It's not appropriate to have this conversation in the hallway. Are we not bothering anyone? Is this convenient? Sophie worried. Richard was meeting such a modest and self-doubting girl for the first time, and for some reason, it was precisely these qualities that attracted him. With someone like Sophie, he felt the urge to be strong, to protect her. However, as they say, first impressions can be deceptive. I live alone, Richard replied. What about your daughter? Sophie asked. She visits sometimes, takes care of me, Richard smiled. Other than that, she lives with her mother, my ex-wife. Sorry, it's not my business. Please, have a seat. Richard indicated the couch. I can offer you some tea. He opened the fridge and exclaimed, I forgot. Stella made pancakes. He took out the pancakes and placed them on the table. Stella, what a lovely name, Larry smiled. Haven't heard that name in a while. I need your protection. Sophie expressed herself directly. Of course, you can refuse and advise me to turn to the appropriate authorities, but Richard, I've already done that, and it hasn't yielded any results. I'm listening, Richard said. I've filed for divorce, but he's been stalking me, threatening me. Maybe you can suggest something. I don't know what to do. I'm scared of him. He beat me so badly that I lost my child. I was in the hospital. What more should I expect? I don't know. You need a bodyguard, Richard said seriously, while a smile played at the corners of his lips, ready to break out. Are you serious? Sophie's eyes widened in fear. Yes, I'm serious. Do you have one? If I had one, would I have come to you? And I don't have that kind of money to afford a personal bodyguard. I can suggest a free bodyguard for you. Richard couldn't hold back and laughed. What's so funny? Sophie felt offended. Young man, Larry interjected. Do you find amusement in mocking someone's fear? Then I apologize. We've come to the wrong person for help. Let's go, Sophie. Larry stood up from the couch, inviting Sophie to leave. Wait, sit down, dear Larry. I just wanted to lighten the tense atmosphere, that's all. I wanted Sophie to relax. I'm sorry if I upset you, Sophie. Are you willing to take me as your free bodyguard? I couldn't even dream of that. And you'll be able to escort me to and from work. I can. But you'll be at work yourself. I have a job that allows me to leave at any moment. I work. But let's not talk about my job. So, how about it? Are you willing to use me for peaceful purposes? Richard smiled. Of course, I'm willing. I start work on Monday, but I need to leave early. I work as a cook. No problem. I'm used to getting up early. I'll come to your house by car. Just send me your address and the time you need to be at work, and I'll come. Richard chuckled and winked at Larry. Oh, and let's exchange phone numbers. Sophie, do you like this, Richard? Larry asked when Sophie's new bodyguard, Richard, dropped them off at Larry's house and they got out of the car. I hope he'll protect me. He stood up for me once before and gave me money for a taxi. I can trust him. I'm not talking about that. He as a man. Is he appealing to you? What? Sophie didn't understand. He likes you. I can tell you that as a man, you appeal to him, and that's why he wants to protect you. Well, you're one to talk, Larry. He's a grown man, a police officer, and me. Sophie, you're beautiful, modest, and there aren't many like you. You just don't know much about yourself. No one has told you. I'm telling you, not only are you beautiful, but there are plenty of young and beautiful women out there. You're kind and modest. You're the best, Sophie, and Richard knows it. He understands that you can make a man happy and be happy yourself. It's so tempting to believe that I can be happy. I want to be happy and bring happiness to others. Sophie dreamily smiled. But Richard has nothing to do with it. Oh, he's definitely involved, Larry thought, but aloud he said, "Everything will be all right for you, Sophie, trust me, everything will be." Mickey greeted them with loud cries, and they understood that Larry's little friend was almost healthy again. "Look how happy she is to see us," Larry smiled with joy. "And it's all thanks to you, Sophie. You helped my little girl and me." Larry hugged Sophie and tears welled up in his eyes. "Thank you, my dear. You're like a daughter to me." And it's not just sentimental words from Larry. It's from the heart, "Sophie, I love you too." How could she file for divorce? James was furious when he opened the registered letter on Saturday. It was a court summons. He was ready to smash and destroy everything in his path. But at the same time, he realized that the furniture in the apartment wasn't his. It belonged to the landlady. He'd have to pay for it if he broke it. So, he got dressed and went outside. He would go straight to Sophie's mother. She had influence over her. That's when she'd convinced Sophie to come back to him. Yes, he'd met his wife with flowers, but before that, there had been a conversation between her and her mother. Her mother had even called him and given him the green light to bring his wife back, saying that she was ready to forgive him. Now, he needed Mary's help. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to break through to Sophie. He'd meet her after work on Monday, but it was almost 2 days until then. He needed to vent the anger that had built up. He needed an ally, and Sophie's mother was going to excel at that. James called and banged on his mother-in-law's door, but no one answered. What got into his head? Probably anger. He should have called. Maybe they weren't at home. Most likely not, or Mary would have answered. He dialed her phone number, and the sound of ringing echoed in the apartment. He started kicking the door and shouting, "Open up, I need to talk to you." A man from the neighboring apartment came out. "Young man, what's with all the noise? There are elderly people living here, and many have little children, and you're causing a ruckus." "Old man, shut the door, or I won't be responsible for what happens." "I won't shut it, I'm at home." "And who are you?" "None of your business." James pushed the old man into his own apartment, closed the door behind him, and continued to shout and pound on Mary's door. The door to the old man's apartment opened again, and a young guy emerged from it. "What are you doing, you jerk?" the young guy said. "Did you mess with the old man?" He got a lump on his head, and his blood pressure went up. "Shut the door and don't talk," James replied. "Don't meddle in someone else's business with your grandpa, or you might get it too." "What's going on?" "Might get what?" The bespectacled guy approached the troublemaker, who clenched his fist and swung at the young man. The young man grabbed James' hand as he swung and twisted it behind his back. "Ouch!" James cried out. "Let go." "No, gotcha, and the police are on their way." James tried to free himself from the guy, but he immediately applied pressure to a certain sensitive point on James' arm, causing him to cry out in pain and preventing him from resisting. 2 police officers were climbing the stairs of the building, followed by Mary and Doug. "What's happening here, Mark?" Mary asked the guy. "This guy pushed the old man. The old man hit his head. Blood pressure spiked. We called an ambulance, and the police too. He's my son-in-law. Let him go, Mark," Mary requested. "I won't let go. He'll have to answer for everything." "Will you be writing a statement?" one of the police officers asked Mark. "That's why you were called," Mark said. "Actions have consequences, and he needs to be held accountable by the law." "Take the offender to the car," the higher-ranking police officer commanded. "I'll take care of the statement." "James, how could this happen?" Mary asked, bewildered. "You should have your phone with you." Her son-in-law glared at Mary. An ambulance arrived just then for the old man. After measuring his blood pressure and examining his head, They said that he needed to be hospitalized because it was unclear whether he had a concussion or something worse. With age, blood vessels are fragile and vulnerable. The police officer documented all of this in Mark's statement and, as they were leaving, said, "Keep us updated on Steven's condition. Looks like your buddy is in for some trouble." "Have no doubt, I won't let this slide," Mark promised. "Mark, can't people make mistakes?" Mary pleaded with him as the police took her son-in-law away. "Why be so harsh? Maybe you can withdraw the statement." "No," Mark replied sternly. "Mistakes? Come on, you're kidding. Normal people don't do things like this. But your son-in-law, that jerk. Don't put both me and yourself in an awkward position. Don't ask for mercy." Mark left, and Mary had no choice but to go back home. "Mom, why do you plead for him?" Doug asked. "He beat Sophie, attacked old people. I don't understand you." "If you don't understand, then just keep quiet," his mother shouted. "You're too young to lecture me. You don't know about life. Just live peacefully. If Sophie divorces him, she'll come here to live. But where will we go? To your alcoholic father. So, to make us happy, we should let that jerk hurt everyone." "Shut your mouth and be quiet," Mary snapped. "I won't be quiet," Doug replied. "You're silencing Dad and Sophie. Maybe Dad drinks because you are always yelling. No respect for your mother. To be respected, you also need to respect others yourself," Doug said, looking his mother in the eyes. Mary swung her hand and slapped Doug across the face. "I won't stay with you for another day," Doug cried, rushing to the closet to gather his things. "I'll go to Dad and Sophie." "Son, please, son," Mary tried to embrace and calm Doug. "Don't come near me with your tenderness," Doug cried. "I don't believe you. You're a cunning deceiver." Doug didn't bother taking his belongings. He grabbed his phone and rushed out of the house. On a Sunday morning, when Sophia returned home, she found Doug sleeping soundly on her bed. He was so deeply asleep that he didn't hear her enter. Soon, their father would return from his night shift. Sophie made pancakes, and the smell of them woke up the groggy Doug. "It smells so delicious, Sophie," he yawned, stretching and hugging his sister. "What are you doing here? What happened?" Sophie inquired. "Oh, Sophie, something happened yesterday." "Something? And where's the hot chocolate?" Doug grabbed a pancake and started eating. "Here's your hot chocolate." Sophie smiled and placed the chocolate-flavored drink on the table. "James was taken by the police yesterday. He hit our neighbor, Stephen, and Mark called the police, filed a complaint. So now, James is in jail." Doug grinned. "You can live peacefully now. But I feel bad for Grandpa. We don't know what's going on with him. The ambulance took him." "What?" Sophie almost whispered, shocked. "He hit an old man." "Yeah, didn't know that idiot Mark was a karate expert. He wouldn't let anyone harm Grandpa." Mom asked Mark to withdraw the complaint against James. And he refused to do it for anything. At last, Sophie sighed. "There's justice for him too. I'm so scared of him, Doug." "Who are you scared of here?" Their father entered the room. "Dad, they took James to jail," Doug declared solemnly and went on to explain the whole situation to his father. The apartment door turned in the lock, and a furious Mary stormed into the kitchen. "Doug, get ready. We're going home." "What are you doing here with an alcoholic? Looking at him makes you one too." Mary nodded towards her husband. "I'll go crazy from your yelling sooner," Doug retorted. "I won't go anywhere with you. I want to stay with Dad and Sophie." "Mom, leave Doug alone. Let him stay with us," Sophie said. "You're happy about this, aren't you? Your husband is in jail, and you've teamed up with this drunkard father and your clueless brother. Instead of helping your husband, you're discussing me." "Mary, that's enough shouting," Brent said. "Mom, I've told you what will happen if you come here shouting." "Need me to remind you?" Sophie warned. "Are you trying to blackmail me?" "You're so much like James," Sophie said. "He starts hitting right away, and you start yelling, 'Mom, give us the key to the apartment.' We don't want you to come here whenever you please and shout at us." "The key?" Mary was surprised. "So, I'm not allowed to come to my own home?" "Mom, you have 2 homes. Isn't that too much for you? Live in my apartment. No one will bother you, but you shouldn't bother us either. If you want to visit without causing a scene, we'll welcome you, but don't intrude into our lives. Give us the key, or we might have to change the locks, Sophie insisted. Mary tossed the key onto the table and left. As she walked down the street, tears of anger and hurt for her children welled up. She had raised them, and now they didn't want to see her. They even took the key to her own home. She once had a family, a husband who was an alcoholic, children, and now it seemed like she was all alone. Did she have no one left? Her children had chosen their alcoholic father, and Mary couldn't understand why everything had turned out this way. "Good day, Richard," Sophie called her bodyguard. "Good," Richard replied. "What do you need guarding for this time?" "Oh, I don't need it now. I'm calling to let you know that James was taken into custody by the police yesterday, so you don't have to accompany me tomorrow. Thank you for your services." "No problem," Richard responded. "I'm sorry you don't need a bodyguard anymore. I would have been glad to protect you. And I'm glad that I won't be distracting you from your work." "You know what?" Richard said. "We need to meet urgently, and you'll tell me everything, and then I'll need to find out if they'll release your husband. You know how it is." "No, I don't know. Can they release him? All sorts of things can happen. But if needed, let's meet," Sophie agreed. "For that occasion, we need to have a drink," Richard suggested after listening to Sophie. "What do you think?" "No, I don't drink," Sophie replied. "Just coffee or tea," and she took a sip of coffee from her cup. "Who does drink then?" "I don't drink either. Let's just celebrate the successful imprisonment of your husband and seal our deal." "Waiter," Richard called, "we'd like champagne, a box of chocolates, and some fruits." "But we terminated the contract," Sophie said. "I don't need protection for now." "For now, but who knows? Let's just not lose each other. We can't afford that." "Well, to our joint venture." Richard raised his glass. "What venture?" Sophie was surprised, clinking her glass with Richard's. "What are you talking about?" "Our joint venture." "What does that mean?" "I don't understand you, Richard." "Dear Sophie, I intend to court you, and I'm saying it openly." "What do you mean, court me?" Sophie wasn't expecting this turn of events. How a man courts a woman. A woman entered the cafe carrying flowers, offering the men to buy them for their companions. "I'll take them all," Richard told the woman. Richard took the flowers and presented them to Sophie. "So many," Sophie smiled. "Waiter, could you please put the flowers in a vase?" Richard requested. "Thank you." Sophie's smile didn't fade. "I'm so pleased. Nobody has ever given me flowers before. There was only a bouquet at the wedding." "I will give you flowers, Sophie. I love giving flowers to women, especially those I really like." "Those you like? Are there many of them?" Sophie gave Richard a playful look. "Not many, just my mother, Stella, and now you, Sophie." "I'm still married," she blushed. "Do you still consider him your husband?" "But we're not officially divorced yet," she said as if justifying herself. Richard embraced Sophie. He looked at her in a way that she understood Richard wouldn't hurt her and wouldn't let anyone hurt her. "It's all so unexpected," Sophie said. "Stephen suffered a severe injury, which led to a surgery to remove a brain hematoma. Despite the severity, Stephen was gradually recovering, and his grandson Mark couldn't let this situation unfold on its own. Monsters like James should get what they deserve." Moreover, at Richard's insistence, Sophie filed a complaint against her husband. With Richard's connections, they ensured that the complaint was taken seriously. They attached a medical report from the hospital to Sophie's statement, and James had to answer for everything. A trial took place, and due to the serious harm he caused to Stephen's health and Sophie, James was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Sophie and Richard's wedding was attended by their closest friends and family: Sophie's father, Doug, Stella, Richard's mother, and of course, Sophie's personal apostle, Larry. Mary, Sophie's mother, was also invited, and surprisingly, she seemed pleased with her new son-in-law.